December 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. 20-year-old Walter Stitt Jr. crouched inside his Sherman tank, hands trembling as he gripped the gunner's controls. Outside, the German SS was launching Hitler's last desperate gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. Inside, Walter was fighting a different battle. The one between the boy who'd volunteered too early and the killer the army needed him to become. The tank rumbled forward through snow-covered roads, fifth in a column of 5 Shermans. Walter's position as gunner meant he had the crosshairs, the trigger, and the terrible knowledge that came with both. When you pulled that trigger, you knew exactly who you were killing. It hadn't always been that way. Before we discover what happened during that fateful pursuit, tell us where you're watching from. Whether you're in Texas or Tokyo, Berlin or Buenos Aires, we'd love to know where our community is tuning in today. Drop your location in the comments below. 3 months earlier, Walter had been a loader, the guy who slammed shells into the cannon without ever seeing the target. You just kept moving, kept loading, kept your head down. The tank commander called out orders, you grabbed the right ammunition, and you didn't think about what happened when that shell left the barrel. "High explosive," the commander would shout. Walter would grab the shell, slam it home, and that was it. No crosshairs, no faces, no knowledge of what you'd just done. But then they made him a gunner. "Stitt, you're moving to the gunner seat," the sergeant had said one morning. Walter's stomach dropped. "Sarge, I'm good where I am." "Wasn't asking, son. We need gunners. You got good hands, and you don't panic. That's the job." The first time Walter looked through the gunner's sight and saw a German soldier in his crosshairs, his finger froze on the trigger. The man was maybe 30 yards away, carrying a Panzerfaust, a German bazooka that could turn a Sherman into a coffin with one shot. "Fire!" the tank commander screamed. Walter's hand shook. The German was just standing there, probably terrified, probably thinking about home. "Fire, goddammit!" Walter stepped on the trigger. The cannon roared. The German disappeared in a cloud of smoke and dirt. Walter threw up inside his helmet. "You did good, kid," the commander said quietly. "It doesn't get easier, but it gets necessary." He was right. After Walter's first tank was hit, after he watched the shell tear through his gunner and tank commander, killing them both instantly after he had to climb over their still warm bodies to escape, it became very necessary indeed. Within 24 hours, they put him back in another tank. Same driver, same bow gunner, different commander, back to the front line. "Welcome back, Stitt," the driver said grimly. "Glad to be here," Walter lied. By late December, Walter had learned to live with the killing. You didn't think about it. You just did it. The Germans were trying to kill you, and if you hesitated, you died. Simple math. But he'd also learned the small tricks that kept you alive, like the turret rotation system. Sherman tanks had 2 ways to rotate the turret, the big gun on top that could spin 360 degrees. You could do it manually, cranking it by hand, which was fast but exhausting. Or you could flip a switch and use the electric motor, which was slower but didn't tire you out. Walter preferred the electric system. Flip the switch, move the handle, and the turret would swing smoothly into position. But the motor was loud, a constant whirring hum that filled the tank. When they were moving, it didn't matter. The engine drowned out everything. But when they stopped, that whirring was all you could hear, and it drove Walter crazy. So he'd developed a habit. When they stopped, he'd flip the switch off. Silence. Peace. Just for a moment. Then when they started moving again, he'd flip it back on. It was a small thing, a routine, nothing important, until the day it became the most important thing in the world. December 23rd, 1944. Task Force Lovely, a mixed unit of tanks and infantry, was racing to relieve the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. The band of brothers were surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition. Every hour mattered. Walter's tank was 5th in the column, rumbling through frozen Belgian countryside. The tank commander, a lieutenant who'd been with them less than a week, stood in the turret hatch scanning for targets. They'd been driving for hours when suddenly the radio crackled to life. Contact front, German column crossing our path. The lead tank commander's voice was sharp with adrenaline. All units, prepare to engage. Walter's hands moved automatically to the controls. He flipped the electric turret switch on. The familiar whirring filled the tank. Driver, speed up, the lieutenant shouted. We're going in. The Sherman lurched forward, picking up speed as they rolled downhill toward a T intersection. Through his periscope, Walter caught glimpses of the chaos ahead. German trucks, soldiers scrambling, and at the rear of their column, an 80mm anti-tank gun being towed by a truck. The 88 was the most feared weapon on the battlefield. It could punch through a Sherman's armor like paper. If that crew got their gun unlimbered and loaded, the American tanks were dead. But the lead Sherman was faster. Boom! The first American shot hit the 88's crew, scattering bodies like ragdolls. Boom! The second shot hit the truck. It erupted in flames, ammunition cooking off in a spectacular fireworks display. "Hold position!" the radio crackled. "Roads blocked!" "Wait for the fire to die down." Walter's tank stopped, the engine idled, and that damned electric turret motor kept whirring. Walter reached down and flipped the switch off. Silence. Beautiful silence. They waited. 10 minutes. 20. 30. The burning truck finally collapsed into smoldering wreckage. "All units, we're going around. Follow the lead tank." The driver revved the engine. Walter's tank lurched forward, following the others toward the burning truck. The plan was to go down into the ditch, around the wreckage, and back up onto the road. Walter watched through his periscope as the first tank navigated the obstacle, then the second, then the third. "Our turn," the lieutenant said. "Driver, take us down." The Sherman tilted as they descended into the ditch. Walter braced himself against the gunner's seat. The turret shifted slightly with the angle of the tank, and the gun barrel swung left and jammed into the dirt bank. "What the hell?" the lieutenant shouted. "Stitt! What's wrong with the gun?" Walter's heart stopped. The turret. He'd turned off the electric motor. The gun was loose, free-floating, and now it was stuck in the goddamn dirt. "Sir, I shut off the electric system. The gun's not locked." "You what?" "I'm sorry, sir. I forgot to turn it back on. Back up! Back up, now!" The driver threw the tank into reverse. They lurched backward, the gun barrel pulling free from the dirt with a sickening scraping sound. Walter's hands shook as he flipped the electric switch back on. The whirring resumed. He rotated the turret, checking for damage. "Is it functional?" the lieutenant demanded. "Yes, sir. Gun's clear." "Then let's go." They went down into the ditch again, this time with the turret locked in place. Up the other side, back onto the road, but they'd lost time. Maybe 2 minutes. Maybe 3. The other 4 tanks in their platoon were already gone, disappeared under a railroad underpass ahead. "Driver, catch up to them!" They raced forward, engine screaming, tracks chewing up the frozen road. And then they heard it. Boom, 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 boom. 4 explosions in rapid succession, 4 distinct impacts, 4 Sherman tanks dying. Walter's blood turned to ice. "All units, halt!" The radio erupted with screaming. "Ambush! Repeat! Ambush under the underpass! Do not proceed! Do not—" The transmission cut off. Walter's tank skidded to a stop 50 yards from the underpass. Through his periscope he could see smoke rising from the other side. Black, oily smoke. The kind that came from burning tanks. "Jesus Christ," the driver whispered. The lieutenant's voice was hollow. Lieutenant Hope was in that lead tank. First day in combat. Walter sat frozen in the gunner's seat, staring at the underpass. 4 tanks, 20 men. Gone in seconds because the Germans had set up a perfect kill zone and waited for the Americans to drive right into it. 4 tanks that had gone ahead while Walter's tank was stuck in the ditch. 4 tanks that would still be alive if Walter hadn't made his stupid, careless mistake. Except, no, that wasn't right. If Walter hadn't made that mistake, his tank would have been 5th through that underpass, 5th into the kill zone, 5th to die. The mistake had saved them. "Dies," the lieutenant's voice came through the intercom, steady despite everything. "We're joining the next platoon." heading south to link up with Patton's forces. Stitt? Yes, sir? That mistake you made back there. Don't make it again. No, sir. But good instincts on shutting off that motor saved our hearing. Walter almost laughed. Almost. Thank you, sir. They rolled south, away from the underpass, away from the burning tanks and the men who died because they were faster, more efficient, more professional than Walter's crew. The irony wasn't lost on him. In war, sometimes the professionals died first. Sometimes the screw-ups survived. Sometimes a stupid mistake, forgetting to flip a switch, losing 2 minutes in a ditch, was the only reason you lived to see tomorrow. Walter never forgot to turn that electric motor back on again. But he also never stopped thinking about those 4 tanks and how close he'd come to being the 5th. The next village was Fauville, a small Belgian town that had changed hands 3 times already. Walter's tank rolled in with the new platoon, 5th position again, always 5th, like the universe had decided that was his number. Stitt, upper story of that house, 2 o'clock, the lieutenant ordered. Walter swung the gun around, found the window in his crosshairs, and fired. High explosive. The shell punched through the wall and detonated inside. Driver, pull up next to the house. They maneuvered close. The lieutenant pulled a hand grenade, yanked the pin, and tossed it through the shattered window. The explosion chased a German soldier out the front door. Walter's bow gunner cut him down with the .30 caliber. Good work. Now pull back, cross the road, get into that field. They backed away from the house, crossed the road, and rolled over a low stone fence into an open field. Infantry soldiers moved up behind them, using the tank as cover. Contact left, someone shouted. Walter started to swing the gun left when he saw him, a German soldier, standing up from behind a wall, hoisting a Panzerfaust onto his shoulder. Time slowed down. Walter could see the German's face, young, maybe 18, scared but determined. The Panzerfaust fired. The rocket-propelled grenade streaked toward them and missed. It sailed past Walter's tank and slammed into the ground behind them, right where the infantry soldiers were standing. Men screamed. Shrapnel tore through legs, faces, bodies. One soldier's nose was torn open, blood pouring down his face. "Gun left!" the lieutenant screamed. Walter was already moving, swinging the turret, finding the German in his sights. The kid was reloading, hands fumbling with the second rocket. Walter's finger hovered over the trigger. The German looked up. Their eyes met through the periscope. Walter fired. The German disappeared. "He's got another shot!" the lieutenant yelled. "Gun left, Stitt!" "Sir, I already—" The second Panzerfaust round hit the tank. The world exploded. Walter was leaning forward, eye pressed to the periscope, when the shaped charge detonated against the turret armor. The blast wave slammed through the tank. The lieutenant's fist crashed into Walter's back as he was thrown forward. Then the man's full weight collapsed onto him. Walter couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The lieutenant's body was crushing him, and the tank was filling with smoke and the smell of burning metal and "Out! Everybody out!" The driver was already gone. The loader scrambled past Walter, shoving the lieutenant's body aside. Walter pulled himself up, grabbed the turret hatch, and hauled himself out into the cold December air. He jumped down from the tank, and immediately his legs gave out. He collapsed onto the frozen ground, gasping. The loader landed beside him. "You hit?" "I don't know, I don't—" "There he is! There he is! There he is!" Walter's head snapped up. The infantry soldiers were pointing at the German with the Panzerfaust, who was running across the field, trying to escape. 10 American soldiers, 10 loaded rifles, all pointing at the German. Nobody fired. "There he is!" Still nobody fired. Walter understood. God help him, he understood completely. Because even after everything, after the training, after the combat, after watching friends die, pulling that trigger and knowing you were about to kill another human being was still the hardest thing in the world. Finally, one of the soldiers fired. Then another. The German fell. Walter put his head in his hands. The loader touched his shoulder. "Come on, we gotta get to cover." They ran back toward a nearby house, infantry soldiers limping and bleeding around them. Walter's head felt cold. He reached up and his hand came back red. "Hey, what's my head look like?" A young private glanced at him. "Doesn't look bad." "Okay, but I should probably see a medic." One of the soldiers, a kid whose leg was bleeding badly, tried to stand and collapsed. "Get on my back," Walter said. "What?" "Get on my back, I'll carry you." The kid climbed on, and Walter carried him across the open field, through the scattered rifle fire, up to the road and into the woods, where they couldn't be shot at anymore. A jeep pulled up. A major with a chest wound was already in it. "Room for 2 more, the driver said. Walter and the kid climbed in. The jeep took them to the aid station, a tent with cots and a doctor who looked like he hadn't slept in days. The doctor pulled pieces of steel out of Walter's head and dropped them into a tin tray. Clink, clink, clink. "Can I have one?" Walter asked. The doctor handed him a piece of shrapnel. Walter stuck it in his pocket. "Go lie down in the other room. Pick a cot." Walter found a cot and collapsed onto it. Around him, 4 or 5 other wounded men did the same. They were all ambulatory, walking wounded. In the Battle of the Bulge, if you could still walk, you were going back. Sure enough, 30 minutes later, a sergeant stuck his head in. "Everybody up! Back to your units!" "We're wounded!" someone protested. "Out in the truck!" They climbed into a truck and rode back to their companies in silence. That night, Walter lay in his bedroll, staring at the stars. His head throbbed. His back ached where the lieutenant's fist had hit him. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He thought about the 4 tanks that had died under the underpass. He thought about Lieutenant Hope, killed on his first day. He thought about his own lieutenant, dead in the turret. He thought about 5 tank commanders he'd served under. All of them were dead now. The next morning, the first sergeant found him. "Stitt, I'm sending you back up. You'll be a tank commander. Make sergeant right away." Walter looked at him. "I don't want to be a tank commander." "It's a promotion, son." "I've had 5 tank commanders, Sarge. All of them are dead. I want to be the gunner." The sergeant studied him for a long moment. "All right, gunner it is. Now get some breakfast." Walter stood up and immediately passed out. Dehydration, exhaustion, trauma. They sent him to a Belgian house to recover. An elderly woman brought him a warm brick from the stove and placed it by his feet. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for him in months. Then the medics came and took him away. First to Liège, then to Paris, then to the coast, then back to England. Walter Stitt Jr. never returned to combat. The army decided he'd had enough. He'd survived when so many others hadn't. He'd made mistakes and been saved by them. He'd killed men and been haunted by it. He'd carried wounded soldiers while bleeding himself. And he'd learned the terrible truth about war, that sometimes the difference between life and death wasn't skill or courage or training. Sometimes it was just a stupid mistake, a forgotten switch, 2 minutes in a ditch. Sometimes that was all that stood between you and a burning tank under a railroad underpass. The hospital in Liège smelled like disinfectant and death. Walter lay on a cot in a ward with 30 other men, listening to them moan and cry out in their sleep. Some called for their mothers. Some screamed about tanks burning. One kid, couldn't have been more than 19, just sobbed quietly hour after hour until a nurse finally gave him something to make him sleep. Walter stared at the ceiling and counted the men he'd seen die. 2 in his first tank, killed instantly when the shell punched through. Lieutenant Hope killed on his first day in combat under that railroad underpass. His most recent tank commander killed when the Panzerfaust hit. And the 4 tank crews, 20 men, who'd driven through that underpass while Walter's tank was stuck in a ditch. 26 men, maybe more. Walter had lost count. "You're one of the lucky ones," a doctor said during rounds. "Head wound superficial. You'll be fine." Walter nodded. He didn't feel lucky. "We're sending you to Paris for evaluation, then probably back to England. You've done your part, son." "What about my crew?" Walter asked. "The driver and the bow gunner?" The doctor checked his clipboard. "Both returned to duty. They're fine." Both returned to duty, back in tanks, back on the front line, while Walter was being shipped to the rear. He should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt like a deserter. That night, Walter pulled the piece of shrapnel from his pocket, the one the doctor had let him keep. It was small, jagged, still stained with his blood. This tiny piece of metal had been inside his head. A few inches lower, and it would have killed him. A few minutes faster at that ditch, and he'd have been under that underpass. A few seconds slower pulling the trigger, and that German with the Panzerfaust would have hit them with his first shot instead of his second. War, Walter realized, wasn't about skill or courage or training. It was about inches and seconds and stupid mistakes that somehow kept you alive, while better men died. He closed his fist around the shrapnel and felt it cut into his palm. "Why me?" he whispered to the darkness. "Why did I get to live?" Nobody answered. They never did. 3 days later they put him on a train to Paris, then a truck to the coast, then a ship back to England. Each mile away from the front line felt like betrayal. His crew was still there, his unit was still fighting, and Walter was going home. He stood on the deck of the ship and watched France disappear into the fog. Somewhere out there men were dying in tanks. Somewhere out there the war was still grinding forward, chewing up boys and spitting out corpses. And Walter Stitt Jr., the gunner who'd made a stupid mistake and lived because of it, was sailing away. He gripped the railing and tried not to cry. A sailor walked past and clapped him on the shoulder. "Rough tour, huh?" "Yeah," Walter managed. "Well, you made it. That's what counts." Walter nodded, but he wasn't sure he believed it. Making it out alive didn't feel like victory. It felt like theft. Like he'd stolen the survival that should have belonged to Lieutenant Hope or his first tank commander or any of those 20 men under the underpass. The ship's horn blasted. England was ahead. The war was behind. But Walter knew he'd never really leave it. The war would follow him home, in his dreams, in his memories, in the piece of shrapnel he'd carry in his pocket for the rest of his life. "Why me?" he whispered again. The ocean had no answer. Walter spent the rest of the war with the 95th Bomb Group in England, working maintenance on B-17 bombers. It was safe work, important work, and it felt like punishment. Every day he watched young crews climb into their planes and fly off to bomb Germany. Every evening he counted how many came back. The math was brutal. Some days 3 or 4 planes didn't return, 30 or 40 men gone. "You got it easy, Stitt," another mechanic said one day. "Ground crew's the smart place to be." Walter tightened a bolt and didn't answer. Easy. Right. At night, he dreamed about the underpass. In the dreams, his tank didn't get stuck in the ditch. The turret motor stayed on. They rolled through that underpass 5th in line, and the German anti-tank gun was waiting, and the shell came through the armor, and he'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, his heart hammering. "You all right, Stitt?" his bunkmate would ask. "Yeah, just a dream." But it wasn't just a dream. It was memory and guilt twisted together, replaying every night in different variations. Sometimes he was faster, sometimes he was slower, sometimes he made different mistakes. But the ending was always the same. Men died, and Walter had to live with it. One afternoon in April 1945, word came through. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Men cheered, they hugged, they cried. Someone found a bottle of whiskey and passed it around. Walter took a sip and felt nothing. "We won, Stitt!" someone shouted. "We actually won!" "Yeah," Walter said quietly. "We won." But winning felt hollow when you remembered the cost. How many American boys had died to push the Germans back? How many tanks had burned? How many mothers would get telegrams saying their sons weren't coming home? Walter thought about his 5 tank commanders. He thought about the 4 crews under the underpass. He thought about Lieutenant Hope, killed on his first day. They hadn't won. They'd just stopped losing. In June, Walter got his discharge papers. He was going home, back to Wheeling, West Virginia, back to his family, back to a life that felt impossibly distant. On the ship crossing the Atlantic, a young replacement soldier, fresh-faced, eager, heading to occupation duty in Germany, asked Walter what combat was like. Walter looked at him for a long moment. "You don't want to know." Come on, I'm curious. What's it really like? Whoa, Walter thought about the crosshairs. The trigger. The knowledge that you were about to kill someone. The way it got easier after the first time, and how that ease was the most terrifying part of all. It's like this, Walter said finally. You make mistakes. Some mistakes get you killed. Some mistakes save your life. And you never know which is which until it's too late. The kid frowned. That doesn't make sense. No, Walter agreed. It doesn't. When the ship docked in New York, Walter stood on the deck with his duffel bag and watched America come into view. The Statue of Liberty, the skyline, home. He should have felt joy, relief, gratitude. Instead, he felt like an imposter, a man who'd survived by accident, carrying the weight of all the men who'd died by accident too. Walter walked down the gangplank into a country that wanted to celebrate victory, but he couldn't celebrate. Not when he knew the truth. War wasn't won by heroes. It was survived by the lucky, and luck, Walter had learned, was the cruelest thing of all. Walter came home to Wheeling in the summer of 1945. His father met him at the train station, older and greyer than Walter remembered. They shook hands. His father's generation didn't hug, and drove home in silence. His mother cried when she saw him. His younger siblings stared at him like he was a stranger. In a way, he was. You look thin, his mother said, touching his face. I'll make your favorite dinner. Thanks, Ma. But when dinner came, Walter couldn't eat. The food tasted like nothing. Everything tasted like nothing. Tell us about the war, his father said. What was it like over there? Walter set down his fork. I'd rather not talk about it. But you must have stories. You were in tanks, right? That must have been something. It was something, Walter said quietly. Can we talk about something else? His father looked hurt, but he nodded. Sure, son, sure. Walter got a job driving a truck. Ironic, since he'd joined the army specifically to avoid driving, but the work was simple, mindless, and it kept him busy. Busy was good. Busy meant less time to think, but the dreams didn't stop. 3-4 times a week, he'd wake up in the middle of the night gasping, seeing the flash of the Panzerfaust, feeling the lieutenant's body collapse onto him, hearing the screams of men burning in tanks. You were yelling again last night, his mother said one morning. Sorry, I'll try to be quieter. Walter, maybe you should talk to someone. The doctor or... I'm fine, Ma. But he wasn't fine. He was drowning, and nobody could see it because he'd gotten very good at treading water. One day, Walter ran into another veteran at the hardware store, a guy from his high school who'd served in the Pacific. Stitt, good to see you made it back. You too. What did you do over there? Tanks. You. Infantry. Okinawa. The guy's smile faded. That was rough. Yeah. They stood there in awkward silence, two men who'd seen things they couldn't talk about, surrounded by people who couldn't understand. Does it get better? Walter asked quietly. The guy looked at him for a long moment. I don't know yet. I'll let you know if it does. Walter nodded. That was the most honest answer he'd gotten since coming home. Years passed. Walter got married, had kids, built a life that looked normal from the outside. He went to work, came home, played with his children, mowed the lawn. He was a good father, a good husband, a good citizen. But inside, he was still that 20-year-old gunner, staring through the crosshairs, finger on the trigger, knowing that pulling it would change him forever. And he was still the guy who'd made a stupid mistake that saved his life, while 20 better men died. Dad, what's this? His daughter asked one day, holding up the piece of shrapnel he kept in a box on his dresser. Nothing, sweetheart, just a piece of metal. Why do you keep it? Walter took it from her gently. To remember. Remember what? How could he explain? How could he tell his 8-year-old daughter that this piece of metal represented the randomness of survival? That it was a reminder that he'd lived while others died, and there was no reason for it, no justice in it, just blind, stupid luck. To remember that life is precious, he said finally, and we should never take it for granted. She nodded, satisfied, and ran off to play. Walter closed his fist around the shrapnel and felt the familiar bite of its edges. Some wounds never healed. You just learned to live with them. Walter Stitt Jr. lived to be 94 years old. He had a good life, a long marriage, children who loved him, grandchildren who climbed on his lap and asked him to tell stories. He told them about driving trucks, about growing up in West Virginia, about the time he caught a fish this big. He never told them about the war. But in 2018, a historian from the Veterans History Project came to interview him. Walter was 93, his hands shaking with age, his voice soft but clear. "Mr. Stitt, can you tell me about your service?" Walter looked at the camera for a long moment. Then he started talking, and once he started, he couldn't stop. He told them about being a loader, then a gunner. About the first time he pulled the trigger and knew he was killing someone. About losing his first tank and climbing over dead bodies to escape. About being back in combat 24 hours later, and he told them about the mistake. "We were chasing a German column," Walter said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "And I'd shut off the electric turret motor because it was noisy. When we went down into that ditch, the gun swung loose and got stuck in the dirt. We had to back up, check the barrel. Lost maybe 2-3 minutes." He paused, staring at something the camera couldn't see. "The 4 tanks ahead of us went through a railroad underpass. The Germans were waiting, killed all 4 tanks. 20 men. If I hadn't made that mistake, we'd have been 5th through. We'd have died too." The historian leaned forward. "How did that make you feel?" Walter's eyes filled with tears. The first time he'd cried about the war in 70 years. "Guilty," he whispered. "I felt guilty. Still do. Those men died because they did everything right. They were faster, more professional, better soldiers than me, and I lived because I screwed up. But you survived. That's what matters, isn't it?" Walter shook his head slowly. "I don't know. I've spent 70 years trying to figure out if my survival meant something or if it was just random, just luck, and I still don't have an answer." "What would you want people to know about your experience?" Walter thought for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "War isn't like the movies. It's not about heroes and villains. It's about kids, and we were all kids, trying not to die. And the ones who survive aren't necessarily the bravest or the smartest or the best. Sometimes they're just the ones who made the right mistake at the right time." He looked directly at the camera. "I made a mistake that saved my life, but it didn't save those 20 men who died under that underpass. It didn't save my 5 tank commanders. It didn't save Lieutenant Hope on his first day in combat. So what does my survival mean? What was the point of me living when they died?" The historian waited. "I think," Walter said slowly, "the point is to remember them, to tell their stories, to make sure people know what war really costs. Not just the ones who died, but the ones who lived and had to carry that weight forever." He pulled something from his pocket, a small, jagged piece of metal. "This is shrapnel from my head. I've carried it for 73 years. Every time I feel it, I remember that I'm alive by accident. And that means I have a responsibility to live well, to honor the men who didn't get to come home." Walter's hand closed around the shrapnel. "So that's what I've tried to do. Be a good father, a good husband, a good man. Because I got to live, and they didn't. And the least I can do is make that life count for something." The interview ended. Walter sat back in his chair, exhausted, feeling lighter than he had in decades. He'd finally said it, finally told the truth he'd been carrying since 1944. He'd survived by mistake, and he'd spent his whole life trying to make that mistake mean something. A year later, Walter Stitt Jr. passed away peacefully in his sleep. At his funeral, his children and grandchildren spoke about what a wonderful man he'd been. Kind, patient, loving, always there when they needed him. They didn't know about the 20 men under the underpass. They didn't know about the 5 tank commanders. They didn't know about the piece of shrapnel he'd carried in his pocket every day for 73 years. But they knew he'd lived a good life. And in the end, maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what survival meant. Not glory or heroism, but simply living well enough to honor those who couldn't. Walter's grandson found the piece of shrapnel among his grandfather's belongings. He held it up to the light, this small, jagged piece of metal, and wondered what it meant. He didn't know it represented the randomness of war, the guilt of survival, the weight of living when others died. He just knew his grandfather had kept it for a reason, so he put it in his own pocket and carried it forward. Some stories, after all, are too important to forget.